This is important because it creates a habit. The habit creates an ease. The ease creates a fluency. The fluency creates a confidence.
Hello, and welcome to the Arts of Language podcast with Andrew Poudois, founder of the Institute for Excellence in Writing, or as many like to say, IEW. My name is Julie Walker, and I'm honored to serve Andrew and IEW as the Chief Marketing Officer. Our goal is to equip teachers and teaching parents with methods and materials which will aid them in training their students to become confident and competent communicators and thinkers. So, Andrew, I most recently heard your convention talk, Cultivating Language Arts, Preschool through High School. And of course, this is something near and dear to my heart because of my grandchild who is a preschooler. And if you don't mind, I'd like to spend a little bit of time talking specifically about this idea of dictation, narration, copywork, and what you can do to help cultivate language arts at the very young age, or maybe for those students who are not quite cooked yet, as what you might say.
Sure. Yeah, this is a great talk, and I fear that I am going to have to divide it into two talks because what usually happens is every time I give it, I think of one more interesting little thing or story or illuminating insight to add in, and you can't keep adding in, and then you go to a conference where it's 50 minutes instead of 60, and what do I cut? So I would probably like to divide it into basically younger children. So you've got your preschool age, 3.5 to 5.5, somewhere in that zone, and then your primary grades. Because there's so much that can be said there. And then with the older kids, it's kind of like you're still doing that stuff, only a little differently, and then you add in a lot more. But one of the things that I have pointed out that many people have realized is that some of these things that have been done for hundreds, if not thousands of years in order to cultivate good language skills are very marginalized or even eliminated completely in kind of the modern education venue. The most obvious of those would be memorized language, which we're not talking about today, but we can link people to that because there's so much to be said about building vocabulary and more complex grammar and syntax patterns into the mind. And that's just like the foundation of everything. And that idea of memorization has kind of been not well appreciated by modern education theory, that somehow memorizing is not creative, or it's a waste of time, or it's tedious, it's rote learning, it's unnecessary because anything that you would need to memorize you can find on your phone. Yeah, exactly. And side by side with that, I think we see the elimination of copywork as a method of helping children gain skill, competence, speed, confidence, fluency, all of those things that are just going to make writing, whether it's on paper now or typing when they're a little older, easier. And so I kind of have tried to promote for people the idea that really when you're dealing with a young child, I'm talking 5, 6, 7, 8 years old, it's way more important that they gain those skills than that they be creative in written expression. And yet so many schools have kind of got this upside down, that creativity is the most important thing, and then they don't do the kind of more what they would perceive as mechanical or dry or uncreative skills that will make the creativity better down line. So this idea of copywork is, in some circles, a little controversial.
Oh, okay. So it's kind of along the same line of the memorization unnecessary, a waste of time, that kind of idea?
Yeah, I think so. Or that, it's tedious. We don't want to force children to do tedious things. But my observation is that we learn pretty much everything through imitation.
Right.
I mean, the reason we speak English is because our parents spoke English and we imitated them. The reason that someone sounds like they're maybe from Minnesota as opposed to Alabama is because of imitation.
Sure.
And so copywork is a natural extension of that natural inclination for children to copy. In fact, before they even know what they're really doing, they'll pick up some pen or crayon or hopefully not a Sharpie marker, and they'll find something and they'll try to do what they see adults in their world or older children doing.
Sure.
So this idea of copywork, we can unpack this. Why is it valuable? And I would argue that at the young age, it's more valuable than any other kind of creative writing you could do, even though it's kind of, in many people's mind, the opposite of creative writing. Well, you think about learning to make letters and learning to write words. These are patterns. You can't possibly learn them without imitating the pattern. And we've been doing this for enough centuries or millennia to know that the best way to imitate is to do it precisely, right?
Right.
And this is true and we've talked about things like music, drawing, other art forms, sports. You don't just kind of say, here, try to do what you see. That's bad teaching, right? Instead, you would say, here, do it this way. And I make the point in that talk that when children start to try to, write letters and you get into copywork, things that seemingly aren't that important, like stroke order, right? When you make a letter, which line do you make first?
Right.
Which line do you make second? This is important because it creates a habit. The habit creates an ease. The ease creates a fluency. The fluency creates a confidence. And if you've got a child who's kind of randomly trying to copy a letter without any modeling of how to do that in what we do know is the best way, that will handicap them down line. And, I meet some kids who came out of a school or the parents didn't attend to that. And you watch them write, and it's just painful. It's like, this would be so much easier for you if you would just do it the right way. But they don't know.
Right.
And so I always suggest, those, you remember, I'm sure, in school, those little alphabet strips. There was one on the wall above the chalkboard, and then there was one on everybody's desk. And it had all the letters of the alphabet, and then it had all those little tinier numbers and arrows. So it'd have like a little arrow with a 1. Make this motion first. And then another arrow with a 2. Make this motion next. And in the rare case where you had 3 motions, there'd be that. And you would just always do it that way. And so just from the formation of letters, building the habit, which creates the speed and the confidence. Then, of course, there's spelling, right? And
before you go on to spelling, I just want to insert a little anecdote here. I had to reteach myself how to do manuscript correctly when I became a school teacher. So my sloppy writing was not going to work for those first graders I taught. So I went through the discipline of teaching myself stroke order, correct lines. This is a straight, it's not a curvy line. It's a straight line. Who knew? And so I would just testify, it's never too late to learn stroke order. So if you have a teenager who cannot write legibly, it's okay to do copy work, right?
I lived in Japan for 3 years, as you know, and I got on this idea of teaching myself to write in Japanese because I thought I could learn to – I actually thought if I could write it, I could read better, which did happen.
Yes, sir.
And if I could read and write it, then I could live in Japan more happily and more successfully.
Well, here in the United States, we only have one alphabet. In Japan, they have 3.
Yeah,
so, oh my goodness.
And
no small task, Andrew.
one of them has 1,000 characters or more to learn. But there's no negotiation in Japanese. You don't debate whether you would use the correct stroke order. You have to do it because otherwise it's just simply not going to be legible and you will not be able to function. So there's absolutes when it comes to writing Japanese characters and the Chinese characters in Japanese. So when I lived there, I thought, wow, that's kind of interesting. If you do it the right way, it's so much better than if you don't. And then, you know, when I came back and started to teach writing and my own children were starting to write, I realized this attentiveness to this small detail can make all the difference. And then, of course, we have the problem of spelling. And there's 2 ways we spell words. One is we think, and then we write what we think. And the other one is we do it automatically, right? And we would hope that, you know, by a certain age, almost all the words we need to write, we can do it automatically, right? I don't have to sit around and think what letters to use to write the word would, W-O-U-L-D, which doesn't make sense, but that's the way it is. Now, how did I get to that point? By writing that word again and again and again and again, however many dozens or hundreds or thousands of times until I would do it without thinking about it. So there's no way to get good, quick, consistent, easy spelling without the repetition of writing words. So it's one thing to know it, and that's okay, but it's another thing to move to where it's automatic.
Right.
And again, the copywork is going to provide the best means of moving it from that, I know this word and I could probably spell it if you made me try, to boom, I wrote it and I didn't even think about it. But if you don't do repetition of writing it on paper, how are you ever going to get from one place to the other? And nobody wants to be 15 years old trying to figure out how to spell the word would. It would be a handicap, a burden, depressing probably. You know? But, you know, there are people. So this is why I'm really strongly promoting this idea of, you know, copywork, and starting in an easy way. And you can start with print, you can start with cursive. There's a debate about which you should do. You know, that's not the most important thing. The most important thing is to do it and to do a little bit every day and watch it get easier and easier and easier.
Right, and this is where I'm going to plug 2 of our products. Printing with Letter Stories, if you're wanting to do stroke order in manuscript, and our Cursive Knowledge, which also teaches stroke order and cursive. And included with both of these courses are copywork exercises. But that's the big question, Andrew. At what age is too late? We kind of talked about that, but perhaps more importantly is what do you copy?
Well, age is just such a hard thing to pin because I have certainly met children who at even as young as age 4 are wanting to write words and letters.
Right.
And why not start? You know, you start in a way that's appropriate. Children by 6 or so, we think, okay, grade 1, that's where it all formal academic year starts or something. But I've also met children who couldn't do that, no matter how hard you tried to make them at that young age. And they take to it much more easily a year or 2 or more later.
Right.
And we've talked, of course, a lot about my son Chris and how he really started writing on paper around 10 years old because before that, the dyslexic, dysgraphic stuff just made it overwhelmingly painful. But, you know, at that later age, he was able to start and do decently well. He could copy about 100 words in 20 minutes and did that for a good year and a half to build up his fluency. And so I really am very hesitant to put age or grade with when someone should do something just because all children are so different.
Sure.
But the most important thing, I think, is doing it in a way that the child is not overly stressed by, and then having some kind of motivational system if necessary, and then keeping at it until, they kind of time out. They kind of show you that this is easy enough that it's not necessary to keep doing it. It's like, a sport or a piece of music thing that you're learning. You do it until it's easy, and then you move on, and you use that as you're doing increasingly complex things. So, but and what to copy? Well, it could be anything. I know I have a grandson who copies one verse of scripture 3 times a day, every day for a week. And what happens is he memorizes the thing as well as learns how to spell all the words.
Nice. As
well as speeds up his handwriting, which is a little on the slow side because he has this perfectionist tendency, right? And sometimes kids, they want to get every letter perfect. And if it goes a little bit over or under the line or doesn't, they get kind of, ooh, it's ugly, ooh, it's bad. So, he kind of just has to do enough where doing it close to perfect isn't taking forever. And then there's other kids who just, hey, I'll do it. I don't even care if anybody can read it. I just want to be out of here. And you get that other kind of anti-perfectionist personality. But you can copy poems. Mrs. Ingham, when she was with us the last time, talked a little bit about how the children would memorize a poem and then they would write the poem from memory, and then they would check their written version with the printed version and how satisfying that was for them. And, we forget what it's like for a young child to do something like that and how it can be satisfying. And I think it's important that old people, teachers and parents don't project onto children that must be boring.
Right.
Children do a lot of things that are engaging to them that might look boring to us. And so there is that. And I remember Mrs. Ingham, in her delightful 90-some-year-old childlike way of being so delighted and showing the delight of children. And then, they can copy stories. They could copy anything they're interested in. My son chose to do for his copy work is like the Usborne Book of Knights or something. And so it was full of medieval weaponry. I think that's so he could copy a few words, look at a picture of a battle axe, kind of restore his soul, copy a few more words, see a cool dagger, And so, I don't think what a child copies is all that important compared to the fact that they are doing it regularly up to a certain point.
Sure. So that's Copywork. Dictation or narration, what would be the next thing that we want to talk about?
Well, these words are sometimes confused by people. So maybe just to define them.
Sure.
Narration generally is when you are telling information that goes through time.
Okay.
Right? That's the general sense of the word. So you can narrate a sequence of events. You could narrate a story. You could narrate a trip that you took. You could narrate a process like making cookies. And so there's a time element, and essentially you're telling what happened. And so this is something that Charlotte Mason talks about in her books on home education,
right,
is the value of cultivating this habit in young children of narrating their experience. Whereas dictation, we would think of as someone telling someone else something that they are going to write down. We even have that word, before there were fancy technologies, people would have secretaries and they would dictate a letter and the secretary would maybe write it in shorthand and then type it up. So that idea of dictation. And in our world of education of children, it can go both ways. One way is for children to hear what you're saying. So you dictate to a child, they hear what you're saying and try to write down what they hear you say. There's value in that. Could also go the other way. They could dictate to you what they want to go into print. So narration is a little less formal. There's no artifact. It's just part of an experience that cultivates speaking skills. And so, sometimes I tell the story of, one of my daughters was just the right age when my wife and an older daughter and I were all reading Charlotte Mason. We're like, this is a great idea. So we really focused on her and we'd do something and then we would say, okay, so how do we do that? What do we do? Or you take a nature walk. What do we see? Now, children won't always get the right order in things because, as we all do, we have kind of a random access memory function that goes to the highest intensity thing first. We won't necessarily always start at the beginning. But with practice, that can happen. You say, that's great. What was the first thing? And what do we do after that?
Right.
And then what do we do? And then what do we do? And so this builds the fluency of relating experiences. It also helps move specific vocabulary into the active zone. For example, if you make cookies with a child and you have them tell back what you did, they may have to use certain words in doing that they wouldn't normally use during the course of a day. Maybe something like measuring cup or whisk in the ingredients or something. And so you're reinforcing active vocabulary sometimes in specialized areas.
Right.
Or you take a nature walk. What did you see? Well, you might see things that you wouldn't necessarily see on a day when you didn't take that walk.
Right.
So
Yep.
the chipmunk gnawing on the acorn.
Okay.
Right? So
Right, yeah.
So there's that aspect. There's the building in a good chronological sense. And then what I've noticed is that kids who do this develop two other kind of peripheral skills. One is attention to detail. When you have the habit of narrating back experiences you've had, and every day or so often you're doing this, you start to fill in more of the details. You're exercising your memory.
Right, exactly.
And so that's a great ability to have. It's, I think Aristotle called it noticing things. It's like, wouldn't we all be better off if we noticed more things? The other thing I have seen is kind of this natural ability of children to kind of tell stories better.
Yes, yes.
Where they get a sense of where is it going to be more interesting or exciting, and then they will use their voice to amplify that more interesting or exciting moment.
This is where I insert a story, of course, about my granddaughter and how she does narration. She always starts off with, once upon a time, there was a little girl named Lucy. And then she goes through whatever story she's wanting to tell about herself. And you say artifacts, and there's generally no artifacts. Well, we have this really cool thing now called video.
Yes.
So we have videotaped her telling one story and where she's describing hide and seek, and she's playing hide and seek with Papa Mitch. That's her grandfather on the other side of the family. And she hid in a drawer in the kitchen, and he could not find her. And so it was just so much fun to watch her narrate the story. And of course, she had to act it out and showed how she hid. So yeah, I think that's a wonderful skill for preschool. It's certainly elementary as they're learning how to tell back. And then, of course, we bring that into our nine units where the students are using a keyword outline and telling it back.
Exactly. And then that carries over into the writing because,
right.
As I've said before, when you write something, you basically have an idea. Mm-hmm. It can pre-exist in your memory or imagination, or it can come externally. It can pre-exist in words like a story that you read or heard. It can
right.
pre-exist in, sight, sound, sensation, memory. But wherever it is, you have to speak that idea into existence. Mm-hmm. Hear what you heard yourself say and hold that in your brain, in your mind, long enough to then go wrestle the words onto paper. And so that speaking it into existence and holding it in your memory are two complex things that can be practiced. And I was actually recording another podcast earlier this morning before we started this. And, one of the questions was, why don't kids like to write? Kids who don't like to write, why not? The simple answer is they get overwhelmed mm-hmm. by the process. Mm-hmm. So these are ways to break that process into smaller, more manageable steps with copywork and narration.
Yep. So dictation, as you said, it can kind of go both ways. I love that because if you have a young child who actually can't write, they can still see that process of speaking words out loud and they turn into an artifact.
Right. And, I'm often encouraging parents to do this with a whiteboard mm-hmm. because then it's even more, it has a greater impact. So the child says once upon a time mm-hmm. and starts their story or whatever, and they see it, the parent or teacher writing it on a whiteboard. It's like, wow, that's mm-hmm. powerful. Mm-hmm. And of course, I suspect you get things like this too. But I get presents from grandchildren, which are written and illustrated by
not yet
a child who doesn't actually write on paper.
I see, right?
But dictates the story. Mm-hmm. Mom writes it down, and then he draws pictures.
Yep.
And then they make it into a little book, and mm-hmm. then that's what I get for Christmas or Father's Day
Andrew.
Or whatever. We also think of dictation as part of the process of helping children hold units of thought in their memory. Mm-hmm. Traditionally, this has probably been taught with spelling. Mm. So there would be some spelling words, and the parent or teacher would make a sentence using one or more of those spelling words. And then the child would attempt to write the, not just the spelling word, but the whole sentence. Mm-hmm. And this, I will admit, is time-consuming.
Yes.
To get one child to hear and remember and listen and write an entire 10-word sentence
yes.
can be a long process. Mm-hmm. And is it worth it? Probably. How much time do you want to spend? That's a question you'd have to think of yourself. But as I reflect on the process, I think, well, writing is kind of like you have to talk to yourself and remember what you said. So being able to listen to what someone else says and remember that long enough to write it down is really a great training for listening to what you hear yourself thinking, which is going to be a little harder to hold on to. So we do see pretty much universally the shrinking memory of modern people. Mm-hmm. We just don't memorize things. We don't cultivate memory. We don't depend on memory the way people did, even 50, but certainly 100 years ago or more.
Sure.
So, sometimes we get frustrated that a young child can only remember like 3 or 4 words and then he forgets the whole rest of it. Does that mean it's not worth doing, or does that mean maybe we should consider making it a little more important to be able to hear something, hold it in the memory, and then practice transcribing that?
Right. And just have to do another product plug here. That's kind of my job.
It is your job.
But the Phonetic Zoo, of course, you give the words. This is an auditory spelling program. You give the words, you spell the word, and then you use it in a sentence. And a child could actually use that as a dictation exercise where they could pause and write down the
Yeah, they would
sentence.
have to pause
Yeah.
the recording for sure.
It'd be
it
go too
wasn't
fast.
designed for that purpose. And, I think a parent or teacher can do this better because they would have a clearer sense of how long a unit of words would be appropriate
Right.
for that particular child or that particular group of children.
Right.
But, again, it's kind of as though our keyword outlines are a huge step in that direction.
Yep.
And I will say that in the talk, to touch on what we started with, cultivating language arts, when I get to the middle school, I talk about the idea that students not just listen to something, but they listen and take notes. So middle school is a perfect time to do this. If they go to church, there's sermons or homilies, maybe there's appropriate content, documentary film, and they could, hear a sentence and then write down key words from that sentence. Hear the next sentence, write down 2 or 3 key words. So they're actually making a keyword outline from auditory language and then practice telling it back. So that kind of combines all of these things into one unit of activity that is more complex and yet certainly doable for most middle school aged kids. And what a great skill to take into adulthood, huh?
Yep. I think, all 3 of these activities, copywork, dictation, narration, super important, perhaps starting in preschool, maybe moving on up through middle school with some of these activities. How much time should a parent or teacher focus on these particular skills?
That's just not a question that I ever answer. I mean, every family's different.
Sure.
Priorities are different. Kids' attentiveness are different. Some kids can do a lot more in 15 minutes than other kids who aren't going to. So, I think the main thing isn't how much time, but are you able to practice consistently a little bit every day?
There you go.
That's where you get the growth.
Yep, a little bit every day. And, this is my recreation major background. You want to leave your child at a place where they're wanting more. So that's that motivation, that's that incentive. Don't do it too long where you're just burning them out, but just giving them a little bit less than what perhaps they want to do so that they're looking forward to coming back to it tomorrow.
Yeah, it's always better to stop before the child gets to a point of exhaustion.
Yep.
Like, I'm done. I hope I never have to do that again.
Right.
We don't want to get that far in.
Well, this is probably the closest we've ever touched on this idea of perhaps something that could be called a Charlotte Mason approach. But we do have families that occasionally ask about this. Does this work well with someone who's wanting to do this? And of course, the answer is yes.
Yeah, absolutely. And I'm not at all fluent with the whole Charlotte Mason world, the underlying philosophies I'm vaguely familiar with, literature rich, of course, and reading out loud to your children, not stressing on starting too young. A lot of people say, well, we follow Charlotte Mason's idea, so we don't want to do writing until, the child is 8 or 9. I'm like, fantastic. There's absolutely no reason why you should feel pressured to start earlier than that just because such and such a school does something.
Yep.
But all children are different. So even people in the Charlotte Mason world, when they use age, it's just all relative to where is that child in terms of their maturity and neurological growth.
Right. And, like you said earlier, if a child is wanting to imitate you at a very early age, then that's when you start encouraging them to do so.
That's when they will pick up that Sharpie and do damage.
Well, thank you, Andrew. Thanks so much for joining us. If you enjoyed this episode and want to hear more, please subscribe to our podcast in iTunes, Google Podcasts, Stitcher, or Spotify, or just visit us each week at iew.com/podcasts. Here you can also find show notes and relevant links from today's broadcast. One last thing, would you mind going to iTunes to rate and review our podcast? This really helps other smart, caring listeners like you find us. Thanks so much.